I'm in a hotel.
We are live.
Good. Good evening and welcome. It's 5 o'clock here in Cape Town in South Africa, and you've tuned in to the next episode of the Attire seminar series, which is hosted here at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, here at the University of Cape Town. And my name is Ralph Borland. I have many of my colleagues here in the room, including Divine Fur, our director. And we're joined today by Carl Manlan. And Carl Manlan is going to be talking about how to attain the Africa we have, transforming with the Africa we have. And Carl is a development practitioner who works at the intersection of public, private, and civil society sectors. And he holds a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School and is a 2016 Aspen New Voices Fellow. He writes largely on African economic transformation. His focus today is on the informal sector. He's also been a Mo Ibrahim Fellow at the Economic Commission for Africa. He's worked on health financing while at the Global Fund and the United Nations Development Program. He's worked with EcoBank, and he can tell us more about where he's currently devoting his energies. So today we circulated two papers by Carl. One of them looks particularly at COVID-19 and the informal sector, and the other is about Carl's early experiences with informal sector traders as a child and how that's influenced his later understanding of business. So we're going to hear from Carl and then we'll have a discussion. So thanks very much, Carl. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Divine, for the opportunity to exchange ideas. And I think this is what HUMA has been set up for, to provide an opportunity to non-academics, individuals that have had different experiences to be able to share. Today, I hope to have an engaging conversation, which is mainly focused on ideas. I will give a few sort of ideas that have shaped my journey. Today, I'm speaking to you from the UAE, where I relocated about 3 weeks ago. And the experience of relocating to the UAE has dawned on me the importance of having an ID and an identification card. And having an identification card is not only for election purposes, it's actually for access to services. And because I have one, I am able to access certain services by the government of this country. When I think about my own childhood, I was fortunate enough to have an identity, to actually have a birth certificate. And that birth certificate has unlocked the opportunity for me to actually be able to attend school, for the government of my country to understand that I was actually coming to join school at a certain point in time. But today on the continent, many people, many Africans don't have actually a civil registration and a civil registration. And the fact that they don't have this piece of document implies that some of the services that they should have access to will not necessarily come to them. One of these services is around access to financial services. And when we think about financial services, it's deeply connected to the question around trade, and it's deeply connected to the question around the informal sector or the popular economy. There are two examples that I think that happen in different cities. I'll start by the one in Addis Ababa. When I used to work in Addis Ababa, there was a driver who I met and really helped me during that year to be on time at work every day, to pick me up after work. And he was part of the informal sector, but it's because of his ability to be on time every single day that I was able to deliver my job in the formal sector. And when we think about these two worlds, they're not necessarily in separate parts of our ecosystem. They're actually very much intertwined. If you're in Nairobi and you take a matatu to go to work, or if you're in Abidjan, you take a baka to go to work, it's that connection between the two that make our societies actually stronger and make them work. But the challenge that we often face is the ability to recognize the value that certain parts of society brings to the development agenda. And what does it mean to want to develop a continent when we don't look necessarily at the majority? And in this case, and what I like to term as the Africa we have, is a collection of skills and competencies that we see every single day. When I was growing up in Abidjan, I used to, and my parents would take me to school, there was always that interesting element around who the informal traders were and the kind of thing that they used to sell. I was fascinated by that. But I also had a constant reminder from my parents that if I didn't go to school, I will become like them. And that concept of them and us certainly started to build around the challenges that we face and what do we understand by progress or success. And is somebody trading in the informal sector had amazing skills that I didn't have at the time. They could negotiate. They could quickly make the sums in their heads, and they could ensure that they understood what the supply chain was. Always fascinated to see them selling a soccer ball or a jersey when they had those big football matches, Cameroon versus Cote d'Ivoire, and all these other games, or an umbrella when it's raining. They had an understanding of supply chain. And it's only when I came to UCT at university that I took my first class in supply chain management, but they understood those skills. But for some reason, we continue to deny those skills the opportunity to enter what we call formal education. And today we speak a lot about entrepreneurship, but these were entrepreneurs, and I think they remain entrepreneurs in their ability to find opportunities in places where some of us may not see those opportunities. But always, there's a one thread which is common to that, which is around health. And health, of course, has been one of the key aspects of my own professional development. Why health is important? It's not important as a standalone. It's important as a vehicle to ensure that development is not for corpses, but it's actually for people that are alive and have the body, the spirit, the mental health as well, all in place to contribute to that Africa that we have towards the Africa that we want. My emphasis on the Africa we have is because we often like to make plans in the future, and some of us may not be part of this future. But if we start to refocus on what we have this intrinsic opportunity and ability to think about how do we allow the lady that used to sell, she probably still does, sell milling porridge down the block of flat where I used to live when I was in Togo. How do we make sure that that business grows? Because the ability to transform with what we have is what others have done. But yet we struggle with those elements. And we want to think about development as something that happens, not necessarily with those in the informal sector. And I want us to think about what we mean by trade and market access, which I think are two important pieces of the discussion around the informal sector. They are men and women that are at different borders. And at those borders, they find the opportunity to trade between two countries, sometimes with challenges, but they do find the opportunity to trade. So when we look at the opportunity to trade, the first opportunity that we should be thinking about is how do we help more of these African traders at borders and in rural areas to be able to sell what they produce. But at the same time, the fundamental question remains, how do we continue to create value from what we have on the continent so that if I am sitting in Lesotho and I want to sell my cotton to somebody who's producing t-shirts in Sao Tome, we have the required logistics and we have the capabilities for the payments to be made and the trust that the goods that are leaving Lesotho will actually arrive in Praia. So the two pieces that are shared touch on the importance of thinking about women as well, especially the second piece, because a lot of women operate in the informal sector, a lot of them in the food or clothing sector. And if we don't have a gender lens in our narrative around transformation and development, we miss an opportunity for the women that continue to educate the next generation. And it is not because we have to do it, but it's the most sensible things to do because also of the numbers. And if you look at the statistic and number of women that we have on the continent. So I would like to pause here with really three ideas that I think are important. The first one is a question around identification. And how do we do development if we don't know how many we are and we can't identify who we are? The second one is around why we continue to define the informal sector as the side element of the development that we want to see. And the third one is we have to stop to think about health as a side business of development. And if anything, COVID-19 reminded us that there isn't development without healthy people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Yeah, I was really interested to read your articles and to have a conversation with you previously about the informal sector, especially as it relates to some of the experiences I've had over the last several years working with informal sector artists, especially wire artists in Southern Africa, in South Africa, and in Mozambique. And, you know, some of the accounts you gave of learning business practices or realizing later what business practices you were being shown by these informal sector artists has also happened to me as an adult artist, in learning from these street level artists who every day is a hustle. They work out schemes amongst themselves where one person makes the work, the other person sells them. They have different models that are basically to do with, is it on consignment or do you buy it wholesale, and how do you split the profits? They know when to hold on to a work and not sell it until they get the price that they want. So I also literally learned from the informal sector artists more about how to practice business as an artist. So I can really relate to your account of the knowledge that's there. And I can also see what damage the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions around it have done to the informal sector in South Africa. And perhaps to connect it to some of our other attire speakers and humor collaborators, Alicio Macabo wrote an essay about risk right at the beginning of the Corona outbreak, which looked at the different concepts of risk in Africa versus Europe and America, and asking whether the same regulations should be applied uniformly in Africa as in Europe and America, because we have very different ideas of what the normal is versus what a state of emergency or a disruption is. And in some ways, in Africa, there can be a continual state of emergency, and through applying these same developed world restrictions, it had a very negative impact on a lot of informal sector practitioners. I mean, just to when you talk about the woman who sells mealie porridge or mealie pup in South Africa, I mean, I think that figure is one who's really suffered in South Africa, because factory workers would buy their lunch on the pavement outside their industrial area. And when they stopped going to work, the woman who was there to sell them their lunch had no one to sell it to, and then she had no money to put into her family. So there was this, I think, enormous trickle down that happened in the informal sector. But yeah, those are just some personal reflections in relation to your topic. I was actually also in a reading group earlier with Keith Breckenridge from Wiser, talking about biometrics and access to finance. So also tying in with your identification. But let's hear from some of the other people in the room. Divine Fu.
Thank you very much, Carl. I mean, first for being here. It's always great to listen to you and to engage you. And thank you for sharing the two articles that you gave us, to read. So I have a series of questions that I think baffle me. And these are questions that I think in the academic space have been grappling with for so many years. So, I mean, first I come from Cameroon. So as you already know, we come from this place where the notion of development is something that can be concrete in a way. I say if you're in Senegal, you can actually see that there is something called development that you can apply in terms of infrastructural change and an attempt, to begin to change people's lives. Then if you're in another country, and it's just an imagination that is extensively extended, over and over and over. So the first question is, after 60 years, because this year, many countries on this continent are commemorating 60 years of independence. So, and when we have to be asking serious questions, after 60 years, should we still be playing with this notion or concept of development as some kind of tool to liberate us? Because 60 years has demonstrated that in fact, we are pushing ourselves to a kind of a cul-de-sac rather than advancing, to some form. And then the other has to deal with the notion of the informal. The informal keeps on being touted as the thing that will free people, the thing that will liberate people, the thing that will develop people, and that we can become. If we are informal. I mean, even in the context in which everyone else is formalizing themselves, but we want to liberate the masses through this thing that continues to marginalize you and makes you a kind of exploitative tool for labor. And somehow, what I find interesting is that we, in a context, for example, in which women are already so deeply marginalized by the structure, we continue to rely on this thing which uses women, young people, and other people just as accessories, for accumulation. How far, to what extent should we continue pushing this debate or pushing these arguments that the economy and also the informal economy, can liberate people? And then the third I have, if the chair can allow me, it's around the notion of solidarity, because you write about solidarity, especially in the context of COVID. And I know you work also around solidarity, which is groundbreaking in the sense that you argue that a lot of what is the notion of philanthropy is not effective enough to capture a lot of the assistance that Africans give to each other. Like through tontines and other things. So I'm just wondering what place solidarity plays, in imagining the future, because solidarity itself already comes with constraints about how to imagine this interdependency that we have with each other. And shall we be pushing to looking for new vocabularies to define our experience? And if we are, so what are these vocabularies that we can be looking for? So I will pause there now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Divine. Let me start by the end in looking at the question of solidarity. The essence of who we are as individuals actually revolves around that element and that element around solidarity. And we cannot possibly evolve without thinking about how do we help the next person. And if you think about the way communities are set up, we are designed to actually provide that assistance, sometimes willingly or unwillingly. If you think about COVID-19, or even let's go a little bit further and think about Ebola in West Africa in 2014, 2016. The first responders was the person next door who didn't know that this person actually had Ebola in Zerekore, trying to take their child to the next clinic or to the place where that person could actually get assistance. And because you have that possibility of having somebody that believes that they can actually provide the help or the assistance, the element around solidarity is extremely important to continue for us to believe in the future that you want to build, because that future cannot be in solitary confinement. It has to be one where we share those experiences. The philanthropy conversation has been, in a way, summarized by a few individuals that have made a lot of money that are redistributing. But the narrative that we don't actually emphasize is that it was a process of industrialization that has created that wealth. And you can go as far back as the big names that we still see around. But industrialization and transformation of the economy was part and parcel of actually getting to the philanthropy conversation. Philanthropy did not just emerge out of the blue, because you need to accumulate to be able to redistribute. So when you come to the African continent, there are very few that have accumulated that we know of. There are many that have accumulated that don't necessarily want to be in the limelight or want to be spoken of. And they do a lot of things in the communities. But the narrative that we accept does not necessarily include them for whatever reason. And that's hard to say. And that's part of me in terms of us rethinking what we mean about philanthropy. And who's a philanthropist? Is a lady selling the porridge around the corner who's helping nieces, nephews, and others to be able to go to school? Does she have in her the ability to be a philanthropist, or do we define her as one? The young person that invents something in a corner of one of the most rural towns that is helping his community will probably never be seen as an entrepreneur, because he doesn't have the definition that we have assigned to entrepreneurship. But the lady that we speak about that is selling porridge, she saw a need for the workers that you referred to. So she created an opportunity to make food so that that food traffic allows her to make money and create resources. But the accepting that it is informal is that we forgot that some of the largest companies in the world today were created in basements, were created in garages. And we read about these stories and we never pause to say, but actually, they were also in the informal sector. And the need to formalize came out of the fact that they were growing. And suddenly they had a comfortable size to actually take it to the next level. But this narrative of informality, we have put that label when it's 90% of our economies in many countries. So if a majority is that, maybe you shouldn't call it informal anymore, but you should accept that this is what it is. And that's what you have as a country or as a continent, and transform with what you have. In the question around, the element around the 60 years, I just moved to a country that will turn 50 in December. And I looked at what they've done in that time. And I'm certainly interested to understand what has helped. Was it the vision, the resources that they have, or the ability to decide that we will be the best? I try to read the local newspaper in every country where I go. And now every day I read one of the local newspapers. And their focus is to ensure that they are the best in whatever they do. And that willingness to be the best forces a certain change in society that we will probably not settle for less. It is true that many of our countries are 60 today, but let's not forget that there's been massive improvement in health outcomes. The number of children under 5 that are dying today on the continent is much less. I don't have the latest figures, but it is going down. But that progress that has been made, we will not think about it necessarily as progress because of the metrics that we look in assessing where countries are. We have sort of resulted to look at the outcome of electoral processes as an indicator of progress. But there's so many things that happen in between that should make us pause and reflect as to what do we define as development and what metric do we use to assess that development. And if you look at how Africans in general migrate on the continent, that can give you an indication of where do they believe as individuals that things are actually improving. The majority of Africans do not migrate outside of Africa. They migrate within Africa. So if you look then at this migration pattern, you should have an indication of what many of our brothers and sisters of the continent define as an element of success or development. Let me pause here.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'm going to hear from, let's hear from both, we'll hear first from Azza and then from Minga, perhaps take two sets of questions that you could respond to. So Azza, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl, for the interesting talk. Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious about, I mean, now you moved to the UAE, and as you said, you are looking at how they are projecting, you know, themselves in all their media, and they're trying to work hard towards the goals of being the best. I mean, for example, like in my work, I'm looking at artificial intelligence, and what they claim that they have the first ministry of artificial intelligence in the world, you know, and they have very progressive, of course, plans for like to implement artificial intelligence in different sectors. But I don't know if you also, I mean, this brings me to your idea, your like opening with this identification identification question, because like I mean in the UAE, it's like also like other countries in the Middle East, they have especially the countries who are part of the like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, these countries. I mean, they have this huge community of people who are called al Bidun, or the stateless people, you know. And these stateless people, they are actually deprived not just from life, they are also deprived from death, because they don't have any kind of, they are not recognized as citizens. So they don't have the right to get a nationality. And when they don't have the right to get a nationality, they don't have access to education, they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to registration, like just registrating their birth certificate or their marriage certificate or their death certificate. So they are completely like their existence in this, although they are from these regions, they are not like migrating off from somewhere, you know. Those are people who are the Bedouin people, who are just because of the changing of the rules and regulations of national identity, somehow they are just they don't belong to these countries. So I know in Kuwait, for example, the ruling family bought citizenship for them from the Comoros Islands. So they want to make them citizens of the Comoros Islands, which is also a very interesting dimension. But yeah, I mean, it's like, for me, it's always like this kind of like very nice picture drawn of development of the Middle East. There's a lot of layers that we have to really be careful, you know, when we claim that, yeah, they are really into development, because they are into development, but they are really lacking when it comes to human rights, you know, just the right of being, you know, have a nationality, that for a huge group of, I'm talking about thousands of people, you know, who don't have that right. So yeah, I mean, you could just reflect on that if you like, to respond to that.
Thank you, Azar. I'll ask Carl to hold that, and ask Minga to speak.
Thank you so much, Raf, and thank you, Carl, for the beautiful presentation. While you were presenting, you almost stepped into my personal experience, as Divan introduced me to the panel, you know, earlier before we started. I think I'm going to respond to the 3 key points that it's a comment. It can also be a question, in addition to what Azza have spoken, because I'm trying to complete something that Azza has spoken already, which you spoke about 3 points: the identification and the problematizing the issue of formal and informal, the formality and informality. And the third one is the health issue that you spoke about. And the reason why I'm saying this, it's because we do have scholars such as Chitonge, Francis Nyamjo. They've worked so hard also in trying to problematize this concept of formal and informal. So what we need to know first, from some of the research that I've done trying to look at this, is that what is informal first, you know, because we know the epistemological root of the term informal are explored in early work of the scholar called Canut Nasdaq, is from Norway. His PhD was based on formal and informal process of development, where he referred his work in describing the development of informality or informal economy and all that, which he says it was also a process to escape the modern form of social process. So now when you speak about identity is about inclusion and exclusion. And I think this is where Aza was trying to go, we have identity because they need to know us in order for us to be classified as a citizen or as a human being. And my personal experience in this country was that when I first came here, I did not have an identity document. They gave you a piece of A4 paper, a huge one called asylum seeker document. With that paper, what happened was that I was working as a car guard, at the same time working as a security guard. And that itself creates some health problem during that process. Now you can imagine having to work in an informal sector, because working in the informal sector, you cannot claim medical aid, you cannot, if you don't work, there's no income and all that. And my account was frozen because I did not have an identity document. At that time, it was in early 2000, I used to bank with Post Bank. That's all. It was still new in South Africa. As time went, they closed my account and telling me that, we cannot carry on with you because you do not have identity document. So I fully agree with you on that point, explaining the issue of identification, even your experience of moving from where you were to where you are. It's all about including and exclusion. That's just the first part. The section of informality also relates to, I do have friends today who stuck with names that are not their names, because when they came in this country, they could not afford medical access. And therefore, there was that exchange of document where one will use his friend's document. I recall when I started security guard, I could not start with my document. I had to use someone else's document. But I was happy to be saved by another South African who had a security company who helped me, to have a document, and also who helped me to have a bank account. So when economists speaks about development, I think we need to understand that, they have a specific way of looking at what is an economy, who are the people involved in an economy. But the question is, how do we define, we as African, let me not use the word African, the African continent is based on informal economy. So how do we define, as you say, our mothers, our sisters, and other people that are doing informal work on the street without tapping into the modern definition of informality or formality? Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Both these points are extremely important in how we reflect on these issues about identification. And I think the example that I use is almost the simplest form of how you can get access to services and what it means to be able to have that document, being a passport or an ID card. The elements around, and if I think about even the African continent and asking ourselves, can an African be a foreigner on the African continent? And if I cross a border today, do I become a foreigner because I don't have the passport of that country or the visa to enter that country? And those are sensitive elements that go into the question about national security and how it is defined, which is really far from the remit of my own understanding. To your point, Aza, those are reality that I am too new in this place to be able to explore. It's been 3 weeks, and I can't possibly make comments on things that I'm not yet familiar with. And those are important points that we have to be able to reflect in terms of being the right to citizenship. And I want to emphasize a point around our own continent. And how do we make sure that on the African continent, regardless of the country where you are from, you cannot be a foreigner on the African continent? And that, for me, is part of a conversation that we need to have around what it is that we're trying to build, the Africa we want or the Africa we have. And I had an interesting experience once where I landed at OR Tambo, and it was a day when passports were changed to biometric passport. I think it was October 2015, I think the change was happening. And at that point, the immigration officer decided that I didn't have a right to enter the country, even though I still had a valid visa, because the passport on which the visa was no longer valid. There I was about to be deported, even though I was a resident, but that particular issue. My good fortune was somebody sensible was able to understand my situation and let me go. I don't know what would have happened if on that day, that element of sensitivity, that sense was not actually brought in and I was deported, because I would have had to explain suddenly that I was deported from a country. So those things don't necessarily happen to others. It's a reality that we have to think about what it means to be African in a continent where we say that we belong. So even the concept of saying, I am an African, what does it mean beyond the borders of your own country if you don't have a right to stay or if you don't have a right to enter that space? So it is not a direct answer to your point, but I also want to make sure that I don't answer when I don't answer just for the sake of answering, but don't have enough information or understanding of that.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to turn to the chat to a message from Lauren Paramore. But just before I do that, I wanted to also just take advantage of my position to also make a comment or reflect on what people had said. So, I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that the first time I heard about the Africa Free Trade Agreement, the idea of it, was from one of my wire artists that I work with, because he had a very practical understanding and awareness of these issues, the idea of opening up borders for the free movement of people and from goods. And right now at Humor, that's what one of our policy working groups is looking at, is this Africa, Free Trade Agreement, which is already like a few years after I first heard it from someone in the informal sector. So in South Africa, it's very much a lived reality that mainly immigrants in the informal sector are very restricted around what they can do in terms of opening a bank account, getting legal employment, accessing health, and so on. And I wondered if there's any differences between people who are self-employed entrepreneurs, the people who are conducting their own businesses and offering services to people, versus people who are being perhaps exploited through employment by others who take advantage of their undocumented status and their vulnerability. So those seem to be like two different scenarios. One of them is people finding their own means of survival in the cracks, and the other is people who are drawn into other people's plans and perhaps exploited. And if you were in America, the implication, if you were employing an illegal immigrant, the implication would be that you're exploiting someone. Whereas in South Africa, in terms of what Minga's account, for example, sometimes it's actually people who are willing to help other people by doing things that break bureaucracies or break laws, but they're willing to work with someone or open a bank account in their name, offer them employment because they recognize their needs, and they're willing to go beyond what the state says they should do in relation to those people. So that's just a bit of musing on that. So Lauren Paramore in the chat, I don't know if you can read it there as well, but Lauren said, yeah. So she's asking about solidarity. about increasing access to financial services in the informal sector in Africa. On the one hand, financialization is aimed at increasing security and access to basic services like healthcare. And on the other hand, does it erode solidarity under the promise of delivery by the state and private sector who have historically ignored the needs of those in the informal sector? Okay, so that's from Lauren.
So, Lauren, thank you for the comment. And I actually don't think that the private sector is ignoring the needs of those in the informal sector, because if you think about the streets of Lagos or Abidjan or Dakar, you find that you have individuals in the informal sector selling the scratch card from telecommunication companies. So there's always a deep connection between the two. The question that you probably ask is, are they getting a fair wage, or are they getting access to the services that they should be getting access to in the context of them being employed, even if that employment is not considered to be formal? The second point around the financial services, I tend to think that joining a financial services platform has to be based on what you're going to bring in or what somebody's going to deposit on it. Because you will find that a lot of accounts are dormant accounts, because you need that economic activity in society to ensure that those accounts are funded. But if it's just to open the account because you need to be part of the formal sector, but the activity or nothing is coming in, then financial services don't necessarily fulfill the purpose that they should be fulfilling, which is allowing for trade and exchange of goods and services, or be paid for that service or pay for that service. So in a way, you can think of solidarity, you can think of financial services as a tool to allow for solidarity. If you think about remittances from the diaspora, if you think about the tontine or the susu or the pamoja mechanism where people will just use cash, but more and more you can see that people are starting to use those digital financial services. But I don't think that it is ignored. Maybe the word could be exploitation to a certain extent, because they're not getting necessarily what they should get to be able to live a decent life. And we still have to define what we mean maybe by decent life in that case. But yes, good point. But I think I tend to nuance a little bit the point.
Thank you, Carl. And Lauren's responding, saying that is a very useful distinction. Thank you. And Divine has his hand up.
Yeah, Carl, thank you very much. I want to take off from where you left, and maybe to go back partly to some of your responses, but also to the 2 articles that you gave us to read and engage. And I want to ask this question again, and that I think I have asked before: can the economy liberate us? I think it's a really important question for us to ask, since we are thinking about how to continue with the continent, and what you're actually offering is an alternative, and an alternative which asks us to take what we think we should not take seriously more seriously. Because it's interesting, you talk about data and identification as an opportunity, but in this tool that has become one of the key, the nexus of the matrices through which we differentiate people, because one of his key tools is also to show how different people are and to give access to resources. The identity card, in many instances of conflict and tension, identity cards have become like tools which people use, to separate people. So when you argue that data and also identification can be an opportunity, I think you are pushing it, but I also think there is something you're trying to push. And what I would like to know is what you're trying to push, because in a way, I think that we may have missed an opportunity to take some people will call it plurality or pluriversality very seriously. That in seeking independence and pushing for decolonization in many spaces, we have tended to believe that this must necessarily be offered through the idea of the nation state. And a nation state which, as we know, its history is about creating this uniform space, this homogeneous whole, you know, whether we're looking at Ufwe Boanye, we're looking at Amadou Ahidjo, we are looking at a lot of these post-independence people from Nyerere, you know, going down to all the people that we celebrate today. Because when we celebrate Africa, the idea of Africa unity as sold is our idea of a place that is homogeneous, that is coherent, and actually that does not take difference seriously. And the question there is, should we be investing in difference rather than continue focusing on this idea of a homogeneous nation state, which at this point, 60 years, at least compared to the UAE that you are in and many other spaces, is still unable to make sense of itself as an independent space. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Divine. And Carl, I think I'll just ask Olerato, who's got his hand up as well, just so that we can manage our time well. So Olerato.
Thank you, Carl, for the interesting conversation. I'm much more interested in the premise that we should focus on almost like what Africa has, which, as you stated, was well, informality, right? And I'm much more interested in how what you think of the attempts to extract value for Africa from informality, particularly through incorporating informality into the global value chains, right? Because I do remember attending a talk about slavery and its afterlife. So that's the title of the seminar. And Dr. Kate Meager was basically speaking about the exploitative nature of incorporating informal workers into the global value chains of the global economy. And she had made an example about I think it was Moroccan argan oil farmers who had their own informal community, but as soon as informal economy, I mean, and as soon as they were almost like hair product manufacturers, exploited the workers to obviously extract, almost treat them as a primary raw resource, raw material for and I'd say raw work, so to speak, raw labor for extracting value without necessarily contributing to the same beneficiations that if those people were incorporated into a formal economy, they would actually have. So partly, it seems that informality, the prioritization of informality at first seems like an interesting decolonial step to go with, in the sense that we should look at ourselves as well. Informality is quite an important aspect of our identity as Africans, as our identity as Africans and how we participate in the economy. But as soon as we somewhat attempt to integrate ourselves in the larger picture of the global economy, it seems that we somewhat end up replicating imperialist, imperialist value chains and value supply chains, so to speak. So it becomes quite concerning that it seems that when African people, or the informal economy, when people tend to want to keep it informal, almost like to preserve it as a sort of kind of identity that it doesn't necessarily need to be covered. Aspect of formality, which is the fact that people get leave days, people get bonuses, get raises, have protections in the workplace. Unfortunately, that informal, like the way formality is thrown around, like commonly, that we don't. So it's quite, I would like to comment how fruitful for us to see almost informality as something that is always necessarily going to be beneficial and something that's going to be different and something that is going to contribute to Africa in a way that kind of breaks away from the almost like the colonial value chains and the imperialist value chains that we've been witnessing for hundreds of years now. Thank you.
Thanks, Olerato.
So I'll start by Olerato's comment and then move to Divine's. There are 1.3 billion informal workers in the world, according to the ILO. 1.3 billion is the population of Africa. And I can guarantee you, if you read the report, they are not Africans only. The majority of them are actually in Asia. So what it is about the informal worker or informal economy in other parts of the world that have been able to be embraced and in a way integrated to see some of the changes that we see in the East and that we struggle to see on the continent. That would be the first point. The second point, if you've been to any market on the continent, you will find goods and services that are coming through the global value chains, either from UAE, from China, and other parts of the world, where Africans travel to those places and bring back goods and services that they sell in the market or in the street or wherever. So the assumption that when you're in the informal sector, you're not part of the global value chain, I don't think is entirely correct. Because they are by definition entrepreneurs, even though we refuse to call them entrepreneurs. They are entrepreneurs. And they are seeking ways to improve their own lives and lives of the community. And you even have narratives around individuals that travel to China, for example, that will not even carry any cash with them. The money will be deposited in the account of the person who's on the other side. And then when they get to the other side, they will actually get the cash and be able to buy for the goods and services. I don't think we should underestimate the value and ingenuity of the Africa of the mind, not even African, of the mind in general, and how people find solutions in places where we probably don't think that they exist. When you talk about extracting value, that's what we do all the time. At every level in which we evolve, we're always trying to extract value. The question is not about the extraction. For me, it's about what do we do with what we extract and how do we make sure that we contribute for something which is bigger than us. Which leads me to some of Divine's point around the differences. In a way, we have accepted those differences about 60 years ago when we became 54 independent states. But 60 years down the line, there's been progress in making sure that there are some form of integration. You have ECOWAS, SADC, and all these different entities that many of us don't even know what they do. And that's part of the challenge, because these institutions, we often hear about them when there's an issue. For example, ECOWAS trying to resolve conflict in Mali with the coup d'etats, for example, or SADC trying to resolve the issue in Mozambique. Then we start to hear about these sort of regional entities. But the lack of understanding of our own institutions is a threat to managing diversity, which is probably one of the challenges that we face around that. And which links me to the point you raised around data as an opportunity. How did we get there, which is linked to the question of identity. There was a time where the identity question was not so contentious. But when we started to think about elections and who has access to the identity card and who can vote, it started to become a little bit more complicated. But if you think about the fundamental use and the basic use of having a civil registration, meaning your birth certificate, it's not for you to vote when you're born. Your birth certificate is an indication for planning purposes for the state to understand that these are the number of children that will be, for example, entering school in 5 years from now or 4 years, depending on the country's legislation. So the politics have made it a little bit more complicated for us to think of identification or identity as a tool, as a right at the time when you are born. And those become a little bit more complex. But in a sense, having the ability to say that you exist, because like myself, I was born in Cote d'Ivoire and I'm a citizen of Cote d'Ivoire. But when I moved to a different country, and I've not lived in my own country for many years, I am certainly not a local. But there are certain rules that allow me to exist in that space. And depending on how welcoming or how challenging it is what it is, one has to accept the rules that govern the invitation to be in that country. And it's always an invitation. Can the economy liberate us? It's always been about economics. If we think about the basic definition of that word, it comes from managing the household. It is not very sophisticated. It's how do we manage the household? And a household can be a family of 4, family of 6, 20, a country, and how do we manage that? And we often forget that the more we become, and the complexity around managing that diversity, even in a family, can also be an interesting indicator of how this goes for a country or a nation or a continent. And maybe we underestimate the difficulty of actually managing that complexity. By the end of the day, if we think about the nations that have been able to pull through some of these changes, they have accepted that there will be consequences to the choice of making those transformations. And as a society, we have to be able to accept or understand some of these challenges and find appropriate ways to deal with the outcomes of these challenges. And they may not always be great, but that's could be a personal judgment. But to my point is that when you have a lady selling mealie meal or selling roasted plantain on the side of the road, that plantain is part of a supply chain. And it's our ability to recognize greater value at each stage of that value chain that will allow the person that is grilling the plantain to probably start to add value to their own life and the life of the children and so on. But as long as we see this as something that I buy on the side of the road, and I'll go to a branded takeaway place, then you have that challenge in terms of where do you put resources of value. Certainly you will value a little bit more the takeaway in a branded place compared to the one on the side of the road. And are we constantly comfortable with eating on the side of the road and accepted that this is what we want, or do we want to help many more to actually open their restaurant and the chain, and that chain can be everywhere you find it. There's a famous South African one that has managed to grow, actually Portuguese South African one that has managed to move beyond the borders, and you find them in a few interesting places around the world. But do we think beyond the borders of our own country? I used to live in a country that I really like a lot, which is Togo. So it has 8 million people, 8 million citizens. But the country has understood its role beyond the borders of beyond the borders that they have. You have many regional banks that have their headquarters in Togo. You ask yourself, why Togo? Well, they created legislation for certain banks to be able to operate from there. They have a port, and they certainly want to position themselves beyond the borders that they have. So in my view, it's fundamental that we look at these as opportunities to resolve problems. And how do we resolve those problems, and for which purpose? If the majority is in the informal sector as we define it, isn't it what we should be focusing on? And why do we look at this as informal when some of the largest corporations started in garages, but we never labeled these as informal? And the micro, small, and medium enterprises across the world, if you look, for example, at the US stimulus package, has focused on how you support micro, small, and medium enterprises. If you look at Europe and other parts of the world, that's what it has been. Even in my dear country of Togo, they created an opportunity to give a social grant during COVID for people in the informal sector, using the identification element and using USSD, so you can have a dummy phone, doesn't have to be a smartphone. It is possible. And I think we struggle to embrace those narrative of changes that we have on the continent, either by default or the lack of access to these informations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thanks for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. I was thinking about one thing in relation to your comparison between the selling the food by the side of the road and then the branded chain of restaurants. And I was thinking, sometimes when we talk about the North, in this context of like North and South, we're sometimes referring to the Anglo-American consensus, you know, as in what happens in Britain and America, and how perhaps in continental Europe, if I think of the Netherlands, you have markets, you know, in the cities that are like their informal sector. You have non-chain store individual shops, and it's not associated with poverty to have outdoor markets that people sell their own produce at. So I wonder if that could have some, if that could represent in some way an informal sector which is valued and flourishing, and is somewhere that sits in between the idea of a branded, you know, sort of chain store company or corporation, or informality as a response to poverty.
I mean, again, the informality is something that we accepted as a definition. When for those of you that are living in Europe at the moment, the Saturday morning market, what is it? It's farmers that are coming to town to be able to sell their produce and go back. And if we were conscious of our ability to redesign our markets and not just transform them into shopping malls, you would have had an opportunity to increase the value of women traders and other traders that are in those markets. But the idea of development has been one where we like to copy. And if we just copy and without having some of the elements that allow it to function, then we may face some challenges. So for me, it's not. Informal sector needs to be formalized. Informal sector needs to be helped to see the value of formalization and using better tools for accounting, for keeping the money, for payments. So the rise of M-Pesa in Kenya, which is the often cited example, it was because, in my view, some of the matatu drivers, for example, accepted that they would be willing to receive that element. And the trust that existed in that society probably helped for people to be accepting to use it. They tried it in other countries, it didn't necessarily take off. But it is what we accept as a definition and how we behave according to the definition that we have accepted.
Thank you, Carl. Some extra time here. So thank you very much for joining us. And this has been another Attire seminar brought to you by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. We're taking a break next week as our speaker postponed until later in the year. And so we'll be back in two weeks' time with our next session on a Thursday. That's it from me. Thanks very much.